Welcome back to the Computer History Room, Steve.
Thanks for having me back yet again.
It's our privilege, so thank you. Today is November 5th, 2019. I'm Marguerite Hancock.
And I'm still Steve Blank.
And you're still Steve Blank. So we were just finishing with the story of rocket science. And I want us to start today with where you began, with quoting what you said here. You said that I was ready to knock it out of the park at Epiphany because it was the phoenix out of the fire. And he said, I don't know what, but I had learned a ton, and so I don't think any of this would have happened without this failure at rocket science. I don't think Silicon Valley would have the lean startup.
Yep.
So that's where we're beginning with Epiphany, and then on to lean startup. Let's start with Epiphany with, you were coming out of this really difficult experience, and then this new idea. Tell us about, you had a familiar partner, but a new idea, a new company.
Yeah, though this one I want to give all the credit to Ben Wegbright. Ben had, been my boss's boss early in my career at Convergent, my peer at Ardent, and then he went off for a while. He was president of Convergent before Ardent, and then he went off for a career as a venture capitalist at Hamburg and Quest, and there he had seen the rise of something called enterprise software. H&Q participated in a bunch of some of the early offerings in that space. And I had never heard of enterprise software. I didn't know what it was, never had dealt with corporate, other than customers in the engineering group. But one day I'm sitting around trying to think about what's next. I'm consulting, this is after rocket science. And Ben comes by and he starts talking about this thing called enterprise software. And he says, Steve, they've automated customer service and support, and they're thinking about automating sales, but clearly no one has automated marketing. And yeah, Ben, why are you talking to me about it? I don't know anything about enterprise. And Ben says, God bless him, yes, but you are the best marketing person I know in Silicon Valley. We could figure it out together. And yeah, thanks. And I said, Ben, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard, And so I don't know what else I said, but I remember sending him away. And this is just, I think it's even pre-internet or barely internet, and so not much information online. But the more I started thinking about it, much like everything like Ben and Gordon Bell told me in my life usually takes me days or weeks to percolate kind of through a slow process. And I went, that is a good idea. And I remember going to Ben's house and sitting out and talking through the idea, which eventually became Epiphany. And so Ben and I were the co-founders based on his idea, and we were going to automate the function of corporate marketing. And then, who else should we get to build the software? Well, Greg Walsh, who was one of the architects at Convergent. And Greg was just coming off a trip in a sailboat for, I guess him and his wife sailed the South Pacific for a year. And Ben was kind of tied up. And he said, well, why don't you go recruit Greg? And I had dinner with Greg. And after that, I get a call from Ben. What did you tell him? He's not interested. I said, well, I told him all about the market opportunity. He said, no. Ben, of course, then goes back and talks to Greg for about 20 minutes, who then joins. And I said, what did you say? Well, I told him how tough the technical problem was. And that was the relationship that Ben and I had. Greg, of course, architected a spectacular system at Epiphany, became the mentor of a whole generation of great engineers who've gone off to great things themselves. And then, make a long story short, as we were testing the idea, somebody I knew from earlier, Joe DiNucci, was at Silicon Graphics, and I was showing him my slides and whatever. He says, that's a great idea. That's a wonderful idea. This is the best idea. But he's smiling as he's saying it. And I'm realizing he's just screwing with my head. I go, all right, Joe, what is it? He said, we already built it. I went, what? And basically, at Silicon Graphics, they had built an internal system called Mind Your Own Business. And it was basically the first idea we had about Epiphany. I said, who built this? He said, I'll introduce you to him if only you'll take me to Epiphany, if you get funded. And so we met our fourth founder, who was John McCaskey, who had literally written what we had thought of as kind of a first release of Epiphany. And so Ben and I and Greg Walsh and John McCaskey were the four founders of Epiphany.
Put
And
us
we
in
got-
the context of the year also.
1996.
Six?
Six. And so we tried to get funded. And we were calling it enterprise automation or enterprise corporate automation and ERM. And essentially what we didn't realize, and Tom Siebel did about 18 months later, is we invented this category called CRM, but I wasn't smart enough to label it as clearly as he did. But that's what we invented. And you would have thought, the entire industry would have, rolled out the red carpet in the venture community and given us a check. We spoke to 23 VCs. Now, half of them I finally understood because by then I had some friends in the venture community who thought Ben was toxic because they knew him from H&Q and said, this is the last guy Ben wanted to be CEO and I didn't care. I'll be VP of marketing, whatever. And they said, not if Ben's in the company. And I just knew that was a mistake. I knew I had worked with Ben now for almost 15 years and knew there was no one better to build a technical team, and I was going to do this company come hell or high water with him. But finally, after enough of these rejections, I had to sit Ben down. It was like talking to your dad about sex. I had to say, here's the deal. And I said, I think we could get this funded if you promise that, when we scale, we'll hire a suit who could take the job and take it to the next level. It was a very uncomfortable, and God bless Ben, it obviously was an uncomfortable conversation. Again, it was like talking to Dad. And he said, yeah, okay, whatever it takes. And we got funded by, even they would have said a B-class VC who had just formed a venture fund, but I had sat on the board with Sam Lee of, I think it was called Infinity Capital Partners, and I've gotten some other term sheets, but basically Sam said if I was ever going to do a company, he'd write me a check and go to his word. On 9 slides, we raised back then the awesome amount of $4 million for an A round, which essentially today is a seed. And it was a seed because all we had were slides. And we started building the company. Ben went around, and it was the bubble time, beginning of the bubble in Silicon Valley. Netscape, I think, had gone public in 95, and there was a race for talent in Silicon Valley. And Ben, did exactly what I thought. Not this tactic, but it was just genius Ben. He put every computer science professor in the country in research universities on the payroll, meaning as an advisory board member to talent spot for us. And instead of just going after Stanford computer science grads, he basically was running around the country at Cornell and other places, getting the best and the brightest who were already spotted for him and running seminars about the future of enterprise software. And so Ben built an amazing team. Meanwhile, I got to get out of the building and to take every lesson I had learned in previous companies and the ones I had forgotten at Rocket Science and apply them about getting out of the building, understanding customers, understanding customer needs, and hired some great vertical marketeers. And John McCaskey, along with the engineering team, helped define the product. John was kind of head of products, Ben head of engineering. I was head of sales and marketing. And Greg was architect. And about 9 months later, we ship a product. And I think I mentioned this, though I'll say it again. Because John came from SGI, he already had working software. And so I said, John, why don't you see if you can take your software with you? He said, Steve, I can't take it. I said, no. Ask SGI, and we'll give them unlimited rights and an option to invest in our first round. And they were so mad. The VP of sales, I forget who it was, or VP of marketing at the time, was so mad at John for leaving, he said, take your damn software. It was the second time SGI
no strings
left.
attached.
In fact,
no licensing.
3 years later, when we went public, I sent the VP of sales a copy of our red herring because our market cap was larger than theirs. As I said earlier, and it happens all the time, disruption doesn't come with a memo, but every once in a while you ought to think that it might. Here was another memo to SGI. So John came, we shipped the product within a year, had $3 million of revenue that first year. Second year, $15 million. Third year, $125 million of real revenue, even though it was a bubble. And about year 2, we go out for the next round and make a very long story short, Kleiner Perkins and John Doerr did the deal. And back then, Kleiner Perkins was the name, along with Benchmark at the time. And we kind of used Benchmark and KP as Benchmark as a stalking horse to get KP interested. Back then, still, you could not go public without a fancy suit, meaning a MBA or brand name. And the rise of the first internet bubble was a race to liquidity, but back then liquidity meant an IPO, and so you needed a name brand to take you out. It's why Google hired Eric Schmidt and others had names. So John Doerr, God bless him, actually did what he said he was going to do and helped us hire the COO of KPMG, someone named Roger Saboni. And Roger had been on the boards or sat through board meetings of lots of technology companies and certainly believed he understood how to run a technology company. And if the bubble hadn't ended, probably would have been the right guy to go to $1 billion. But there were a couple of fun transition points in that. I remember when we were trying to hire Roger, and one of his requirements was he wanted to be the 5th founder. Well, what did that mean? Well, he wanted the same equity as us. Okay, if that was the requirement, and this was a brand name and whatever, and Ben and I had more voting power than John and Greg, so it was basically Ben and I on the phone call with Doug McKenzie, who was our Kleiner board member. Now, back then, it's hard to believe now, but founders took token pay. We were making $60,000 a year. That was what you did as a founder. Hopefully, you were going to make it up at the liquidity event, which back then was almost always an IPO. And there was no taking money off the table in any rounds. That was unheard of. So we were living off of $60,000 a year. But the deal was Roger wanted $250,000. Wow. He wants to be like co-founder, same stock, but $250,000. So I didn't think it was unusual to ask in this conversation with our board member, hey, Doug, we've been working for 2 years at $60,000. Do you think we could get $120,000 a year? And I still remember, quarter century later, Doug's response. You're just the effing founders. Who the hell do you think you are? It was not a pleasant conversation. And I have to tell you, 25 years later, every student who's ever asked me what firm they should go to, Kleiner Perkins has never gotten mentioned. And when it does, I suggest that there are other firms to consider. Must be 150 to 200 companies that they've not seen. Obviously, to me, the founders are everything, and that it's a team that makes this happen. But that was not what you wanted to hear from a board member who kind of got caught up in the moment, I think, and I'm sure 25 years later has also a different perspective. But Epiphany was great learning. We
had some adventures along the way.
I'm sorry?
There were some adventures along the way.
Huge adventures. But I took every lesson I had learned to that point and applied it in a new field I knew nothing about, which was enterprise software. But we built a really successful company. Roger, to his credit, brought a lot of good big company tools and techniques. Hired, at least the one thing that changed my life was he hired Karen Richardson as head of sales, and Karen was not just good, spectacular. And Julie Peterson as head of PR, both world-class people. To Roger's not detriment, but I've seen this movie before now that I work with large corporations, is he didn't have a clue what a startup was. He couldn't even find the bathroom in the first week. His job and his skill set was world-class execution. And when we were in execution mode, he was probably second to none. Problem is when the bubble collapsed, the company, and in fact the entire industry, needed to go back to searching for a business model, and that wasn't his skill set. But his execution, I think pretty good. For execution strategy, it was a flaw between Kleiner and Roger in that they had what I'd call Tom Siebel envy. they not only wanted to be in CRM, which we already were, but they didn't understand what it was, so they decided to clone a Siebel strategy by doing acquisitions that, in hindsight, were both inane and insane. But as a world-class executor, I learned a ton. Sorry for the soliloquy.
Well, I was just thinking about this arc that you've created of Epiphany, and along the way there's some new issues that came up. Can you talk about the Microsoft issue, being sued by Microsoft?
Oh, we weren't sued. You mean over the letter E?
Well, the letter E and the issues that came up of the letter E and the little
and the swoosh.
And the swoosh.
You know, we had created a logo that looked a lot like the Internet Explorer, and we had done it first. And the name of the company was Epiphany. And E. How hard is that? And so we got a cease and desist from Microsoft Legal. That said we own the letter E. Like, I wrote a letter to Bill Gates, and I don't know if I ever sent it or got sent. Maybe comma heads intervened that said, "Gee, there's some other letters and symbols you should probably go for as well. Maybe the $sign or your initials or something else." But I don't think that. I think the letter E is in the public domain, and somehow it just kind of disappeared. But I thought that was hysterical. I just thought it was funny. I thought you were going to ask me about the other Microsoft story, which was.
Well, that's coming next. Go
right,
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So one of the things I did at Epiphany, which I didn't do in other companies because I wasn't smart enough and, quote, listened to my board, was in Epiphany we got a ton of advisors, and I thought of them as chess pieces. After learning what I learned, you never want to get an advisor when you need them. You need them as kind of resources that you could play as needed. Some advisors, and my rule for our advisory board is you were going to respond to a phone call within 24 hours. That was it. I'll give you some stock. I may never call you. And I must have had 40 people on the advisory board. I probably never called 10 of them. But there are others that, you use them and then you started using them more. I'll give you more stock if you're coming in and training, working with Ben and teaching database marketing. Jeff Ullman came in and did exactly that, taught about the database architectures to the engineers. And so we got more stock as advisors. But Gordon Bell, who had been my mentor, was now at Microsoft, and Gordon was an advisor. And I didn't know what or why, but somehow I figured someday I was going to need to go and get to Microsoft at a high level. And I discovered that Microsoft had an RFP, a request for proposal, out for a system that looked just like ours. They were using some mainframe for database marketing for their giant mail list and for customers and for resellers, and they were going to move it in-house. Except the system they picked was actually going to use Oracle's database. and I assumed it was some sweetheart deal that they just never told the rest of their company that that's what they were going to do. So I tried to insert myself, even though the RFP was clearly written for a vendor. There's going to be a rule of thumb that if you haven't helped write the RFP, by helped I mean assisted in creating the spec, it's not written for you and you're probably going to lose it. But this was like a $12 million deal. And I said, it's written for us, even though it's not written for us. And so I called up the guy who was responsible for the selection and the process. And he said, and this is the wrong thing in my whole career to do to me, because when you do that, it just incensed me even more. He said, don't worry your little head, you're never going to get this deal. It's not written for you. Oh, that was a mistake. So I called up Gordon. I said, Gordon, can you let Bill Gates know that one of his key pieces of software is about to be run on an Oracle system? And that they won't even let us bid, Microsoft SQL Server. And in less than an hour, I got a phone call back from, I'm blanking his name, not Bill, but the head of sales and marketing of Oracle that said, you're now in the bidding process, come up on Monday and present your system to us. Make a long story short, we won. We won, and the guy who told me don't even bother was no longer at Microsoft. It was a great story. But it was a relentless story. It's what you did as an entrepreneur is that, I say it a million times, but no to an entrepreneur, it's just the beginning of a conversation. No to normal people is like, thank you, I understand the social cue, I will leave. No. Well, what exactly did you mean by no? No, I meant no. It's a bounding box. It means no, not to me. No, at least when I was a rapacious entrepreneur and relentless entrepreneur, it was just the start. Was that your question?
That was my question. I did want to hear that story also. So you had early customers as well, and started to work, as I understand, is this correct, in the incorporate your business model hypothesis for customer? Is that around the time that you really developed that? Can you talk about that?
So if you think about some of the history we've been talking about, getting out of the building started at, in full-fledged at Supermac, got beaten into me earlier at Ardent, and so I've been practicing some of this stuff. But this notion of finding product market fit, agile engineering, which we still weren't doing, but kind of were finding our way into, well, why is it they only want customer feedback early in the process? Well, they were doing waterfall. And once they got into the spec, it was really hard to change, et cetera. My best epiphany story here, getting out of the building with Ben, was about Schwab. And so one of our advisors was Mary Kelly, who was head of database marketing at Schwab. And for my advisors who were in corporate positions, I was pretty upfront with them. I would say, I want you to buy $1 million worth of my software. And all of them were, adult enough to say, Steve, you can't pay us to do it. I said, no, you don't understand. I want you to teach me how to build the system that you will feel good enough to buy $1 million. Oh, and that's always the beginning of a good relationship. And that's exactly why I did want them. It wasn't why I was going to give them stock to pay them off, but I did want them to tell me honestly why we were screwed and why we won't get an order. And Mary Kelly was perfect. She was the perfect customer. No. And finally, about the 5th time, I got, nicely thrown out of her office. She said, you don't understand, Steve. Your architecture just doesn't support householding. Now, in hindsight, that was embarrassing. Householding is a simple technique, is that if you live in a house and your wife has a different last name, we still shouldn't be sending you 2 of the same offers, physically or virtually, nowadays virtually, to the same. We ought to know that it's a household. Our architecture didn't even allow any possible way to do this. It wasn't some add-on marketing thing I could talk my way around. It was just missing. And not only, and Mary was nice enough to educate me, Steve, if it's missing for me, it's going to be missing for every customer you need to talk to. So this is where getting out of the building and the relationship with Ben that we had set up was great. Ben got in the car, we drove to San Francisco, and he listened to Mary explain the same thing, this time in more technical detail. And Ben asked 4 or 5 questions, and okay, we leave. And I now knew Ben, don't ask anything, just drive the car back. And we passed the airport, and we're talking about lots of things. We passed the Palo Alto, we passed lots of... Now, we're about to get off in Mountain View, and I know, okay, he's just holding out on me. I said, Ben, what are we going to do about Schwab? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean? What? We just went through this whole thing. Well, he said, what about householding? He said, well, show them page 6 of the spec. I said, Ben, the spec only has 5 pages. And he said, not anymore. And so this relationship of both getting out of the building, being agile, teaming up with your engineering counterpart meant you weren't going into engineering meetings pounding the table about feature requests. You were not only listening to customers, you were bringing the people who could actually make those changes, hear the same data, and then come to the logical conclusion that, yes, we were missing it. And instead of me having to convince engineering, Ben went into the next engineering planning meeting and the feature was scheduled. And Mary Kelly, good to her word, when we could not just say we could deliver, but when we could demo the product. Schwab became a customer. And it became, right next to Microsoft, a huge logo on our IPO offering document.
Well, that sense of those partnerships really started to ripple through, and it was, at one point, recognized as a very, very fast-growing company. And
huge. It was $0 to $100 million in revenue in 3 years.
In 3 years.
A good part of that was understanding customers. A good part of it was Saboni coming in and understanding enterprise customers. When I first met John McCaskey, he was thinking, oh, maybe we get $5,000 for this product. And I just felt like a genius. I said, John, you don't understand. We could get $50,000 for this product. And then we hired our first VP of sales before Joe DiNucci, Jay Larson, who had some enterprise, who was actually a great Oracle salesman, said, Steve, you don't understand. Oracle doesn't sell anything for less than $500,000. And when Saboni came in, it moved to $5 million. Now, the same product 3 years earlier that John McCaskey thought was $5,000, I thought was $50,000, Jay thought was $500,000. It was the same software. And lots of interesting stories in between. Jay Larson actually helped me understand how to turn a customer development process into actually finding a repeatable and scalable sales process. And that was an incredible education. And that was the beginning of understanding the distinction between search versus execution. We hired Jay probably 18 months too early. Jay came from an environment like Oracle where there were known products, known data sheets, known customers, known sales processes, known whatever. And so we were using a sales deck and it wasn't working. I mean, I remember trying to pitch to the head of IT and finding ourselves in the parking lot fumbling for keys in a pouring rain. And it was terrible. We get in the car and Jay's about to drive us to the next account. And I go, Jay, where are we going? He goes, well, Steve, salesmen have tough skins. And we're going to, make the next call. I said, no, we need to rewrite the presentation. Obviously didn't work. And Jay starts, you can't do that. I memorized this pitch. And that's when I realized there was a distinction between searching for a business model and executing one. Is that what we were discovering was that we needed to search. And what most world-class salespeople, or certainly sales executives are comfortable with, was execution. And that was the beginning of some of the understanding of the key tenets of Lean.
Before I would like to focus on that next, but before we do, let's talk about how you ended at Epiphany in a very unusual way.
Which part of the multiple unusual ways?
Well, I know several. I for sure talked about the day that you chose to retire, the day before the IPO.
Yeah, it was a long, drawn-out conversation. When Roger Saboni came in, he characterized Ben as kind of the crazy aunt you hide in the attic when the guests come. And again, it was people just misunderstanding hugely this guy's value. And it's usually people who didn't have to build things or people who didn't never been in the early stages of a startup. The company wouldn't have been there without Ben, and it suffered after. And so he wanted to get rid of Ben, but since Ben and I had already decided that we were going to hire a CEO on day one, we realized that we might lose our stock if we're not careful. And being a venture capitalist, Ben had actually figured out how we could keep our stock forever, that is, having a golden parachute. And because we had worked with a Series A investor who liked us and had other issues they wanted from us, they allowed us to actually put our golden parachute not in any series document, but it was written into the state incorporation papers. And of course, when our second round VCs, Kleiner Perkins, reviewed all the documents, we made sure we mentioned, please make sure you review the state incorporation documents. Okay, we had it in writing that we told them that there was stuff they needed to review. And when Roger tried to fire Ben, we laughed. Because I remember saying, Roger, you can't fire Ben. You could move him out of the company, but he gets all his stock. And he said, I'll get back in class. It was great, Roger. I'll get back to you on that. And 3 weeks later, he comes back and he said, yep. And so Ben left with all his stock, and they wanted me to stay through and do the IPO roadshow. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, I'm leaving. You got rid of Ben, I'm going. We argued all the way they did the roadshow without me, and I retired the day before the Section 16B went effective, meaning the day before it went public. And then the bubble collapsed about 6 months later.
So, before we leave Epiphany, is there anything else that you want to?
It was a great company, world-class people, great run in a bubble, very different time, very different liquidity events. Learned a good chunk of the blocking and tackling of what would become the Lean startup later, though I didn't know it. And even people, I guess there are two big learnings. One is I finally was able to articulate the key differences in a founding team. And if you didn't have the right team, it was going to be a struggle. And the right team, for example, is Ben was the innovator, but I was the entrepreneur. And we appreciated each other's skills. And McCaskey and Greg had different, they were kind of hybrids in different ways. But Ben and I think, epitomized those two distinctions. I could never do Ben's job. And you know what, in a pinch he might have been able, but he wasn't as crazy as I was, meaning being able to do that too. And I have taken that as kind of a foundation elsewhere, watching teams get formed. The other one was watching Roger. And that's the difference between, as I said earlier, search and execution. They're very different skill sets. And then Roger, and I'd say it for me as well, I didn't quite appreciate the skill sets of a world-class executor. And trust me, he definitely did not appreciate the skill sets of world-class entrepreneurs. Yet those Venn diagrams also need to coexist in a company, and certainly as one grows. And it's that culture clash that happens as companies scale, the difference between search and execution, and when those roles switch, that actually screw up growing companies. That was Epiphany.
That was
run.
Epiphany.
Great run.
Great run. September 1999, you retired.
Yes.
You're only 45.
Yes.
You have a big exit. By the way, was the valuation was north of 300 million? What was
No. Valuation was north of $8 billion by February 2000.
Wait,
on the secondary. It got acquired for piece parts, what I'd call it, about 3 or 4 years later for $300 or $400 million. But during the peak of the bubble, huge.
Huge.
Stock was like 180 or something.
So you could choose what to do next.
Yeah.
And so lead us into the lean startup.
Yeah, so everybody expected me to do Startup 9, and even me, kind of.
Did you think about that, or becoming a VC, or just an
No,
angel investor?
Well, I went through the typical phases of angel investing. As you retire, I've discovered few people know exactly what they're going to do, particularly when you're healthy and young and whatever. But, there's a test I kind of use, is at Epiphany and others, I would call people up in New York and say, I'm going to be across the street tomorrow, in a meeting. Do you have 10 minutes for a coffee? If they would say yes, I would jump on a red eye for that meeting. Big idea. I would do that to get a meeting for 15 minutes if I thought it would move my company forward. After Epiphany, I ran that test and said, I'm too rich, I'm too old, and I like my kids too much. And I realized that was a killer if I was competing with someone like I used to be. And that would be unfair to the company. I would be like Alan Michaels at Ardent, sitting in the building. Does that make sense?
It does.
And so that was a very quick heuristic sort of test. And so I started thinking about what I wanted to do. I bought a house next to mine, set it up as an office, which was a big mistake because when I would meet people, I'd have to make coffee, have to go out and get pastries, and then have to turn on the heat. It's a lot easier. I should have just I still have the house, but it was like, what was I thinking? So I started thinking about, Startup 9. I meet Scott Andrews, who headed up Nissan's R&D division in Silicon Valley, and he found some young guy named J.B. Straubel, and we start talking about building these things called electric cars. And we start this idea called Flux Capacitor, which is the name of this startup. And JB is sketching these ideas of hybrids and electric cars, and he's driving around Palo Alto in his Porsche 944, trailing a lead-acid battery pack, behind it, his own conversion. And 6 weeks into it, I think, I'm doing this test. Can I fly around the country and whatever? And I go, JB, this is going to take 10 years and $50 million, off by at least 2 orders of magnitude in both capital. And no, I think Elon got it down to 20 years, but thank God. And JB was mad at me, wouldn't talk to me. And he was right, of course. And as I'm sure your viewers and readers know, he became the co-founder of Tesla, and literally here in 2019, finally just retired after 20 years at building the architectures for all the battery and platforms for the cars. But that was my only half-hearted attempt at startup number 9. Would have been a great startup, but in fact, JB ended up teaming with essentially a Steve Blank, which was Martin Eberhard, and Elon became the first investor and then booted Eberhard out. And that was my Tesla experience, but if anybody wants them, I still have the first J.B. Straubel slides on what eventually became Tesla. So here I was kind of noodling in this, but I was also thinking about my history. So here I am. I had done 21 years, maybe if I count Ann Arbor, 23 years of startups, 8 or 9 of them, different industries, different technologies. Now sitting on I was now sitting on public boards as well, private boards, doing tech investing. And I had been no different than any other startup CEO or employee. When you're engaged in a startup, your head is down and you are executing. Yeah, if you're looking, your bore sight is maybe, your competitors maybe, if you're smart, your industry, but you don't have time for big thoughts you're not a thought leader. You're which is why the industry is full of practitioners, not researchers, because survival depends on execution. And now for the first time, I had the ability to kind of think about what I had done. And so the first thought was that the world really needed my memoirs. And in hindsight, it was really just a catharsis of being able to get out what I wanted to write. And I think I talked about this earlier in one of the histories we did. But basically, as I started writing them, a couple of things came up. And I would summarize every company I did with lessons learned. And after I got through those lessons learned, and I still remember out skiing, page 80, the lessons learned were really filling in a much bigger pattern. And the couple of patterns which now seem obvious was, number one, startups were not smaller versions of large companies. Everybody in the Valley understands that. But when I said it in 2000, it was heretical. It was like, Steve, what are you talking about? It was like, what else is there? Well, back then, startups did everything large companies did. Large companies wrote business plans. Why, of course, a startup would write a plan. A large company would do a 5-year forecast. Well, of course, a startup was supposed to predict the future, 5 years, even though everybody, including the investors, knew that was ridiculous. Large companies hired heads of sales and marketing and CEOs and biz dev, and they used waterfall engineering to assume that everything you wrote down as a feature was exactly what customers were going to need at the end. Those were all assumptions. And I felt, I felt that was wrong. That wasn't my experience. That startups were actually something different. Startups were searching for now what we call business models where companies were executing them. And here was what was important. We had no formal tools or methodologies to kind of describe, even if I was right, what is it you should do? And so I decided to take this on myself. And I was forming these ideas. I got invited to guest teach at Berkeley by somebody I still work with named Jerry Engel, who ran the Lester Center for Entrepreneurship inside the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley. And Jerry still tells me we had met earlier. I didn't remember, but he said, oh, you tell great stories, and why don't you come and tell some stories in some of our classes? And so I started telling stories, but what Jerry didn't know, and he didn't know what he would have, is that my career started as an instructor. And I kind of remembered I kind of liked teaching. And so I started guest teaching in some classes at the same...
This was early 2000s, 2002
or so? 2001 and 2, but at the same time, I was working on a book that would become the foundation of the Lean Startup, which is called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And the 4 Steps to the Epiphany was essentially about one of the 3 components of Lean. And the 3 components are get out of the building, and there's a methodology called customer development. 2 is agile engineering, which is how to build products rapidly and iteratively and incrementally. And then 3 is a business model canvas from Alexander Osterwalder to kind of map your hypotheses. But back early on, as I was just trying to formalize the get out of the building, all right, you're out in the building. Should I be standing in the parking lot? What do I say? What do I do? What I'm looking for? eventually became this idea with, in fact, Mark Andreessen labeled called product market fit. What you're looking for is, glad you had these hypotheses, but inside the building you were just guessing. So why don't we actually see if we could match up the customer needs to what you think you're building? And so I remember taking a computer, a printer, and lots of paper to a vacation spot we would go in Hawaii, because it had
brought
no.
it all with you?
And I would ship a box of books, and my wife and kids remember me sitting by. It was a place no longer around called Kona Village on the Big Island, and for we spent a month every year there, and I would get a good chunk of writing, and that book took me about 2 or 3 years to write. In hindsight, as I said, you could describe the idea in about 30 seconds and 3 minutes if you're slow, but it took several years because there was no context at all. I read all the literature that existed about corporate innovation and entrepreneurship at the time, all of it. And all of it was fundamentally, how do you innovate inside a large corporation? The only books out there was one by Bill Davidow, Crossing the Chasm was in the future. Not much literature at all about innovation in early stage ventures. And so what I realized is I was creating a category. And it took a while.
Well, for good reason.
Yeah, well, someone much smarter might have done it faster. But and then to just follow up, I convinced Jerry Anglo to allow me to teach this as a class at Haas. And so the first customer development class, which wasn't experiential, it was based on cases, but it was me reinterpreting HBR cases, which were typically Sally is sitting around the table thinking about the problem, or Dave took a walk around the lake, and they were all on the surface execution problems, but I reinterpreted them as failure of customer development problems, and so taught the class that way. But still, didn't quite feel right, but in the meantime, a company I had invested in, who was run by one of my ex-VPs of engineering, Will Harvey, had a new young co-founder named Eric Reese. And Eric was going to be his VP of engineering. And I said to Will, I've written you a bunch of checks in the past, haven't made much money. I got this new idea how to build a company. I'll write you another check if you take the class. And so Will and Eric would drive up to Berkeley. Will would admit later, I was muttering, what a waste of time. And Eric would be muttering, what a great idea. And so Eric Reese became the first implementer of customer development ever at his startup, Will and Eric's startup called IMVU. And since I was on the board, I got to watch them run these experiments. And Eric's major insight immediately was, Steve, you invented customer development in a world of waterfall engineering, but no software engineer, or at least in the Valley, is going to use that anymore. We're all doing Agile. And customer development is a perfect fit with Agile engineering. And so Eric's contribution was Agile. And then, a couple of years later, Alexander Osterwalder came out with a business model canvas, and the lean process became those 3 components. But Eric became not only the first practitioner, he became the Johnny Appleseed of the movement, meaning while I wrote the theory, he proselytized the practice, and still does today in a way that it became obvious that it should just happen. That's the lean startup.
Tell us about some of you alluded to the students that you worked with. So many people who teach, measure, just as venture capitalists or people talk about the founders that they've helped enable. As a teacher, as you started to move to, we're teaching at Berkeley and Stanford, and talk about their students. Who
Some of my students?
Yes, some of the students that you impacted.
Actually, let me start with the TAs.
Sure.
So when I started teaching so I was teaching at Berkeley, and I forget who invited me. I guess Tom Byers at Stanford in the STVP program, the Stanford Ventures, Technology and Ventures program inside the engineering school, invited me to teach there. At the same time, I was teaching at Berkeley. And Tom, I don't know what he wanted me for, but he got a lot more than he asked for. I had to pay what I call penance, which was teaching a lot of the existing classes. I created a new one for some of the Singaporean students that had a partnership with the National University of Singapore. But all the while, I had in my head that we needed to do a different type of class that just didn't exist. Remember, I was teaching customer development at Berkeley, but it was still using case studies, and like you had to write reports, and
Very traditional.
very traditional, and was now getting a little more comfortable in academia at least as an adjunct. Talk all about, if we have time, adjunct versus tenured faculty in a second, but I was just honored. I was teaching at Berkeley now. I'm being invited to teach in Stanford. How wonderful. But I realized that the capstone class in any business school, any university for innovation and entrepreneurship was how to write a business plan. Now, 5 years after we've been talking about lean, or maybe 10 years even, it's still how to write a business plan. I mean, there are lots of, variants on it, but it's how to write a pitch or how to do X and Y. And my whole philosophy was innovation entrepreneurship is experiential. It's about getting out of the building. It's about chaos and uncertainty and figuring out product market fit. And we're teaching you how to make some slides and a 5-year plan. What's wrong with this? Why are we behind? And so I decided that we needed to kind of reset all our assumptions. And that if I wanted to do a class, I wanted to do one that closely emulated what a startup in the 21st century was really like. Number one is it was team-based. Number two was going to be based on getting out of the building, testing hypotheses that you had on day one. Number three is it was going to require you to build minimum viable products. That is, iterative and incremental prototypes that were derived from what you learned week to week. And that was just non-traditional. And so I pitched that to Tom Byers, and God bless him and Tina Seelig and Kathy Eisenhardt at Stanford. I mean, why on earth would they let me do that? I still, to this day, have no idea, given my lack of credentials. They went, sure, okay. And so I did. I created a class which was called the Lean Launchpad. And because it was so radical, and by radical, I don't mean it wasn't clear it was genius or anything. It was just different. It was nothing like this existed. I decided, by then I had a blog, about a year old. I decided to blog every week of the class. Here's what I wanted to accomplish. Here are my slides. Here's what the students presented. Here's what I learned. Here's what worked, here's what didn't. And even my friends said, Steve, no one's going to read this. This is the most boring thing ever. You write about entrepreneurship. Now you're writing about education. What the hell do you know? And they were kind of right. And much like everything else in my life, I ignored them. Because what I never would have expected, remember I said earlier, part of my philosophy was stick out your thumb and see where life takes you? I never would have been able to compute or pre-compute that back in Washington, D.C., the head of commercialization of the National Science Foundation, Errol Arkolek, was reading my blogs, as he said, like they were a serialized novel. And the day the class ends and the blog is over, I get a phone call, and I still remember I was driving on the Stanford campus. Hi, you don't know me. I'm from the U.S. government. We need your help. And Errol and I still laugh about my response, which was this was just in the middle of what was called the surge in Iraq. And I was thinking maybe somebody was calling me from my government help. And I blurted out, I already gave the government my help during Vietnam. I'm not giving any more. Little did I know about later in my career, but Errol and I still laugh. He said, no. I'm from the National Science Foundation. And he said, I should have hung up when you said the next thing, which I said, what's the National Science Foundation? Of course now it is basically one of the key national research funding agencies in the United States. NIH, $35 billion a year. NSF, about $8 billion, funds all basic science research, and except for life sciences and universities. And the NSF had this problem is the U.S. government had started something called the SBIR program, which was a way to fund anybody who wanted to commercialize science. Been going on for 30 years, and it was not producing results commensurate with its money, which means if Congress had ever asked how well they're doing, they'd all be in jail. And Errol realized they needed something different, and so did the leadership of the NSF. Long story short, as Errol tells the story, and he's written up something that the museum should probably have, which is a great history of the program, he adopted my class and said, help us turn it into a national program. And so the NSF adopted the Stanford Lean Launchpad class and now called it I-Corps for the Innovation Corps. Me, my TA of the class, and two other VCs, John Fiber and blanking on who else, and the TA was a woman named Miura-Ko, who we'll talk about in a second. Um, Taught the first class of 75 students, 25 teams, and the NSF thought it was the best thing that ever happened to these teams. We got them to do things in weeks that they've been saying, their program managers saying, I've been trying to do this with them for years. And so we put together an educator class. I wrote a 200-page training manual. I trained the first trainers. Fast forward 5, 6 years later, now it's 9 years. We've put over 1,500, maybe close to 2,000 teams of the country's best scientists and engineers, over 5,000 people. I-Corps is now, some variant of it is in 98 colleges and universities in the United States. It's written into law. It's, it's something that survives 10 years at the NSF, I think, is considered a win. And then the White House, under the Obama administration, the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, had a head of innovation entrepreneurship named Tom Khalil, who got engaged. And Tom looked at the program and said, why isn't every federal research agency doing this? And so Department of Energy, NIH, and others all kind of adopted some variant of the I-Corps program, including the Department of Defense. And we'll talk about some of that later. There's an officially acknowledged I-Corps at the NSA, which has put more people through the program than the commercial versions. But back to your question, my first TA in that class was a woman named Ann Miura-Ko, and I introduced Ann to a young VC who I knew named Mike Maples. And I said, you two would be the yin and yang to each other. And they were. They ended up starting a firm together called Floodgate. And some of my other TAs, Stephanie Zahn went to Sequoia. Anna Khan is at Bessemer. And for some reason, they're all women who became VCs.
Well, Stephanie John was on our Next Gen board.
Oh,
and
right.
Anne has spoken. And in fact,
Yes.
her one word, Thunder Lizard,
Yes.
is up there. And her conversation that we had on our live programs is actually going to be aired by KQED
That's
next
great.
time. So.
Yeah, so Ann has turned into a killer VC, but she was there at the beginning and participated mightily in the beginning of that whole lean movement. She was there on day one. And obviously, as a practitioner, has seen it kind of evolve in ways I couldn't even imagine. Some of the fun student stories were in that Lean Launchpad class. There was a set of students who wanted to build a autonomous lawnmower. It was early days of computer vision, and they were great computer scientists, and they thought, what a great thing, we could make something that looked like the Mars lander surveyor, that big, and it would mow lawns and golf courses. And even coming in the class, I knew, getting these guys out of the building. And very quickly, as they got out of the building and they were passionate about this, they were building hardware for vision, but they were also realizing that having somebody making minimum wage is usually who's riding those lawnmowers, and a $250,000 machine versus $1,000 and this was what the class was great about, because you could have lectured that to them, but them feeling failure in the face. And the only thing we do in the class is sometimes steer the students but not tell them. And we suggested, perhaps you ought to look at agriculture in California. And they had no idea there was agriculture in California. Yeah, Stanford. Okay, drive 90 miles east, you'll hit agriculture. And we gave them a little more direction. And of course, they came back and very quickly discovered that, computer vision, weed versus crop. Hand weeding for organic stuff is really expensive. If we could make a device that could actually recognize weeds versus crops and figure out how to kill the weeds, maybe we'll have something. And make a long story short, spoke to 100 to 150 customers, literally built a minimum viable product of a machine vision weeding identification machine, hand pushed it through farm fields, and was able to prove that they could do what they said they could do. And then fast forward 4 years after the class, they got acquired by John Deere for $300 million.
Well done.
And Jose Jared is now the head of AI projects at John Deere. Another version was a student team at when we finally did the Stanford class. I took it back up to Berkeley and was now teaching that at the same Lean Launchpad class at Berkeley. And there was someone named John Sebastiani who wanted to build a beef jerky company. Beef jerky, like they get that in gas stations, and buy. It's not a tech company. I don't even know if this process will work in non-tech. But okay, let's try it. Got out of the building, same thing, and you got to talk to 10 customers a week, and he's pivoting and learning all about channel and branding. And week 7, you're supposed to come in every week with 10 customer visits, and your presentation and teaching team is what you learned. And John says, Steve, I only spoke to 1 customer this week. Now, everybody knows if you've done that, you're told, sit down, you don't deserve to present. And John goes, no, you really want to see my 1 slide. I said, you spoke to 1 customer and you got 1 slide? You don't get to, Steve, and I went, finally, well, he wants to show us something. All right, I'll make an example out of him. And he puts up 1 slide. It's a check for $475,000 from Safeway.
Touche.
He holds the John Sebastiani, and the company was called CRAVE Jerky. And so CRAVE became a pretty big brand. He got acquired after 2-3 years by $250 million from Hershey's, and now runs his own startup incubator for food brands up in Sonoma. So those were kind of some fun students, though to be fair, it's only this year that some of the new teaching team at Stanford started tracking the alumni. By design at the time when I started the class, I did not want it to be an incubator. Now Stanford has StartX and some other things. Berkeley has Skydeck. But to mix, back then, an incubator inside of an academic curriculum, I thought would create too much havoc among the tenured faculty. And now you get away with it, and maybe I should start another version. But I really focused the class on teaching the methodology of Lean rather than I'm teaching you how to get funded and incorporated and how to raise money and whatever. I thought there'd be other classes for that. I wanted them to painfully remember what it's like when a customer goes, no, you got it completely wrong. What was your question?
Well, we're just finishing with the students. Okay. And so we talked about some of your students and some of your RAs. How about some of the impact that you've seen through the government programs?
Oh, boy. Which programs and which?
Well, we can, you described just briefly Corps NSA. I think we're trying to understand behind the story not only what happened, but the so what of it. And
so what happened with Lean is my work, Eric Ries's work, Osterwalder's work, basically in the last decade or two changed the language of Silicon Valley, right? If anybody here talks about waterfall engineering, I mean, you kind of like go, maybe they know something we don't, but hello, it's the 21st century it called, though you're still running that large company. So now we're way past that. I mean, people now know we move with speed. There's some process you use, the tools and technology are way past what I'm doing, but not in the government, not even in large companies. So what's really interesting is watching in 2000 I want to say 15 or maybe 13, the Harvard Business Review put on the cover Why the Lean Startup Changes Everything. And it was an article I wrote, but it gave large companies permission to now for the first time look at startup tools because they were waking up to notice that startups are like starting to take some of their business. And just as a sidebar, by the way, and I haven't heard it articulated like this, but companies still have not woken up to that competition with startups is not competition with startups. It's nowadays competition with an unequal economic system. That is, large companies compete in a capitalist system that's measured by profit and loss and shareholder value, etc. But startups are not measured by that at all. They're in fact, a very different economic system, as different as socialism and communism is for capitalism. They're in a subsidized capitalist system where profit and loss have no meaning. At least if you're unicorns and you're driving for liquidity and you have growth capital, that's a very different economic system. And it's that interface that are actually confusing both large companies and startups. And the government faces the same problem. We think we're competing with, or we're organized, at least in the Department of Defense, to deal with counterterrorism for the last 20 years. And now we're waking up thinking we're competing with potential peer adversaries with China and Russia. But we're not. We're competing with China and Russia, who have very different systems, who have fused their military, commercial, and academic systems, much like the U.S. did in the 1950s. And we're now trying to figure out how do we match that. And so the issues are even a little more complex than simple competition. And so about 5 years ago, I started getting involved with helping large companies think about innovation entrepreneurship, and also started thinking about government thinking about innovation entrepreneurship. And for the government side,
Can I just interject here
Yes.
that both organizations are notorious for being slow-moving, hierarchical, and all these other things that are, in many circles, considered antithetical. So these are
yeah, and
maybe an undeserved caricature, but
No,
not
they're-
an easy area to work in.
No, but the caricature actually describes something else. It's a caricature only because, and this was, remember when I talked about it on a personal level, Roger Saboni didn't understand startups, and I certainly didn't understand at the time the world he came from. Large companies get large and are capable of managing and scaling because they build processes and procedures and OKRs and KPIs, that is metrics, to manage repeatable and scalable processes at scale. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so you build process that actually works in a normal time that are repeatable. It's only when something outside perturbs the system, that is, your competition are not peers moving at the same clock speed, or technology has shifted. That is, it's a very adaptable system within the system it's working. Does that make sense?
It does, it does.
And so
Thank you for that.
from the outside, it looks lethargic. It has 100,000 people. They pay the checks, they make the money, etc. It's in fact, when the deregulation happens, or a crisis happens, or oil shocks, or something else, or new technology, unless they've built a way to capture and rapidly sense and respond and adapt to changing environments, unless they've built that into their DNA, they typically fail rapidly. And if you think about it, most companies let that skill set atrophy over time. Does that help? Yeah. And in fact, my next book will be on that process, about how to keep that going in something called an innovation doctrine. That surviving companies actually do. It's what Amazon, Jobs under Apple, the Koch brothers, Ray Dalio at Bridgewater, all have kind of innovation doctrines, though right now they're kind of articulated as kind of words of wisdom from, 14 points from Amazon, Ray Dalio's philosophy, or how to go through the Koch brothers kind of management by something school. But they all were kind of doctrines of shared beliefs, processes, and tools and techniques. But back to the government part. About 4 years ago, that is about 2015, I ran into someone named Pete Newell, who used to run the Army's Rapid Equipping Force. And Rapid Equipping Force was essentially, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Army's rapid innovation arm. Believe it or not, the Army had realized that they didn't have 15 years to provide solutions to problems they hadn't seen in decades out to the battlefield, where people were going to keep dying. Whether these were counter improvised explosive devices, or how to provide water and power on forward operating bases, they needed like non-off-the-shelf stuff, but new. And so in 2003, they set up the first group, and the leadership of this group, because of the way Army rotates, changed every 3 years. Pete Newell, I think, took it over in about 2012. And I met Pete because in my regular Stanford Lean Launchpad class, there was a special forces operator who said, "Hey, what you're teaching sounds a lot like what Pete Newell did on the battlefield."
I wonder if we could talk about your hacking for defense.
Right. That was when I met Pete Newell.
So I think that's really the next
Yeah.
step, to talk about Pete Newell and
Joe Felter and
right, your hacking and at CSAC and maybe your first class and
So part of my interest, obviously, since my career started in the military, I kind of had a view that when we ended the draft during the Vietnam War, at least in this country, we disconnected the body populace from having any skin in the game of foreign policy, which is why in the 20th century, and we kind of engaged in perpetual war. So all volunteers, and didn't touch much of the elite, because if where in the coastal elites, your kids went to college and, went on with their careers, and the military wasn't part of your history or your family or whatever. And we ended up kind of bifurcating the country in a way that I don't think was healthy. And so I always had believed that we should have some form of permanent national service, and I don't mean, unlike some countries, permanent military service, but at least for me, whether I had gone in the military or if there was any other form of service where if I had been an 18-year-old who had to give a year to work with other people from other parts of the country, seeing things I didn't know, I think it would have not only made me a better person, it would have been great for our country. And so I've constantly had this idea that the U.S. should engage again in national service, and it still seems to be a third rail among the politicians, but I don't think for the body populace. In fact, the day after 9/11 and 9/12, if George Bush would have said national service versus go shopping, I think we would have seen a very different country, because we all would have said, well, obviously. And a lot of people just volunteered anyway. The people I meet today, a good number of their careers started right after 9/11. So in any case, that was one of the impetuses. When I met Pete Newell, we both thought we were going to have a meet and greet, 5 minutes. One student suggested we both meet, and Pete described what he called his problem curation, and which I'll describe, process on the battlefield, and I described lean, which is essentially on the boardroom. And we realized we invented almost the same process, though his, rightly so, was more figured out on how to deeply understand whether the problem you're getting is a real problem or a symptom of a problem. Because you had to prioritize the stack of things you were going to work on, and is this really the problem, or is this kind of much deeper that someone else has already solved it, or it's just a communications problem, etc. And then how to rapidly get solutions out to the field. Whereas I had kind of assumed you're coming in with a known problem, and the lean methodology was not how creativity or problem curation. It was like, let's go find product market fit. And what we discovered is if we connected the two pieces together, we had what we called an innovation pipeline. And we both had the same interest, along with another founder of his company called BMMT, was someone named Joe Felter, an ex-Special Forces colonel who was now teaching at CSAC. And Joe went off to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia from 2017 to 2019. He's, at least as of today in 2019, back at Stanford, back at CSAC. But Joe...
And for our audience, we'll just say that CSAC is
sorry.
the Center for International Security, right? And
at Stanford.
And cooperation.
So kind of the public policy strategy arm that Hoover Institute and the Freeman Spogli Institute as well, kind of that core of that part of Stanford. And the three of us started thinking about, could we adapt and adopt the Lean Launchpad / I-Corps class, where people were coming in with their problems, to actually use the same methodology, but go out to the Department of Defense and other government agencies and say, give us your toughest problems, and we'll get students to work on them. And at the same time, I was talking to Pete, it dawned on us that the State Department had the same problems. And Tony Blinken at the State Department, and I'm blanking on his tech rep out here in Silicon Valley, came to us with the same idea. And so that same year at Stanford in 2015 or 16, I believe, we stood up two classes, Hacking for Defense with the Department of Defense and Hacking for Diplomacy with the State Department. And we had students who were obviously some very interested in solving refugee problems and some interested in solving improvised explosive device problems. And it was just a hit. It was very different students than the Lean Launchpad and I-Corps classes, but exact same methodology. Get out of the building, minimum viable products, for 10 customers a week, etc. And interesting things came out of both. Fast forward 3 or 4 years, Hacking for Defense has now been written into the National Defense Authorization Act. It's now, like I-Corps, managed by a government agency that's called the National Security Innovation Network, which is part of Defense Innovation Unit here in Silicon Valley. And Hacking for Diplomacy died when we fired the State Department, essentially in 2017. But other variants of Hacking for continued. Columbia University stood up Hacking for Energy in partnership with the state of New York. UC Berkeley has done 2 versions of the class, hacking for nonprofits and then hacking for local, with the first case being the city of Oakland. There's going to be a hacking for oceans with Santa Cruz and Scripps. There's now versions in the UK. Duke has done hacking for the environment. So there have been variants of the platform, which is simply use the Lean Launchpad course methodology, but go out to sponsors, this not economic sponsors, but problem sponsors, and get problems in a series of domains. And it actually has been a successful program.
So you share the curriculum. The model is that you share the curriculum, and then the local faculty are teaching, or do you have any kind of training or
so when we did
hacking
sharing? For defense, so it's now hacking for defense is taught in 30 universities, and of course the first thing we did is write an educator guide, much like I did for I-Corps. So this time I had Pete's help, and so Pete and I wrote another 250-page, basically taking the I-Corps curriculum or my Lean Launchpad educator class and reconfiguring it for DoD, and then held a train the trainer class. And so I have found that it's pretty easy to scale these things if you give them the manual, give them examples, hand them the slides, do the videos. So I've done videos. So here are the kind of the basic tutorials, and so it's almost a class in a box that that could be taught. I mean, it's not easy, but it's better than having to roll your own. I've been incredibly grateful that Stanford and Byers and Eisenhardt and Tina Seelig at SDVP have allowed me to do that. So we've basically, that group in Stanford now has 2 national programs that have reached over 100,000 students and thousands of educators. They have a whole set of wonderful instructors and do great research on the innovation and entrepreneurship, both corporate and startups. But the practical stuff they developed is just kind of mind-boggling. So it's nice to be in a place that punches above its weight, and it's given me the opportunity to do that. I'm just blown away that I could do that there.
Yeah, it's amazing. Those are longtime friends, but for you to have from that very early experience to then apply it in so many domains, students, and then to have it scale is remarkable. So
I think we're done.
I don't think so. I'm sorry. We're still next. Next, I wanted to talk with you about. I want to talk to you about your secret history of Silicon Valley.
I think the answer now is I can neither confirm nor deny.
This is another topic that brings together your long interest, military, the role of the military in Silicon Valley, and you gave the lecture here at the museum, and it's you have many versions that you've given. It's still one of the most watched videos here. Can you just summarize for this record basically your argument that you make there?
Well, it's not an argument, it's just an observation, is that most people believe the history of Silicon Valley is a commercial history. It's started by, the lore, the museum, in fact, emphasized, started with Fairchild and Shockley, Fairchild, Silicon, then computers and drives and peripherals and whole commercial history. Turns out the data says that's not true at all. The Valley was actually built on a military industrial history from Fred Terman. That the Valley was actually a microwave and defense valley, and that kind of laid the ground for the entrepreneurial community and the people and the university that actually enabled silicon and semiconductors and software and hardware to take root. That's I guess the core of the as you would call it, the argument.
So let's just step back, and we've seen the Valley create and recreate its leading edge through successive waves of technology, and we're on the cusp of several now. So many people come to you and search for the answer, what's the DNA of Silicon Valley, or what's the secret sauce? Would you answer them differently today than you have in the past? And how would you answer that question?
Well, the Valley has always attracted the outliers. One of the things that I think most people figured this out now, but when you used to see people who wanted to create their own Silicon Valley, they kind of neglected to understand that the Valley wasn't designed as a job creation engine for the people who lived here. An innovation cluster is a magnet from people outside. It's a big idea. And so the first thing is, what attracted people, the best and the brightest here? Well, number one, the weather. Right? It was like, if it came from any other place in the country, and you go to, I remember a company called Kendall Square was trying to recruit me to be their VP of marketing in Boston in February. And I on purpose picked a restaurant outside to sit at in Palo Alto as they were trying to recruit me. And I happened to know there was a blizzard in Boston that day. And we were sitting out in 65-degree weather. And I knew he knew what the weather was back home. And we weren't even through the main course. He said, not a chance, is there? I said, not unless you're going to have me stay out here. So number one, the weather. But number two, the intellectual capital that was already here in Stanford. Fred Terman had already built the engineering school, at least in microwaves and electronics, and to be the peer of probably MIT by the mid-50s. And three is that the culture, and this was Annalise Saxenian's insight at Berkeley when she wrote Regional Advantage, that back in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, pre-internet, no one knew what you were doing back home. So if you grew up around Boston and you were working in a company, you'd probably go home and see your parents at least once a week or once a month. And mom or dad would say, so how's your job? And you go, just great, because dad had worked at this old job for 35 years before they gave him the watch. If you said, I'm thinking of leaving, your parents would be hanging black crepe or leaving my job around the windows. What are we going to tell the neighbors? What are we going to tell the relatives? Because no one left their jobs. The cultural structure was you worked in the same place forever, and your job was your life. Here in the Valley, people were changing jobs and still are changing jobs every 18 months to 2 years. That was the norm. But to try to tell people back home that was going on, people were living different work lifestyles. They were going to San Francisco at the time to live different personal lifestyles. But it wasn't visible to your family back home. You could do anything out here. And that was a huge part of what turned Silicon Valley into a very different place than Boston, which was the other possible place for an entrepreneurial explosion in the mid-'70s. And it didn't take off in Boston because of the culture, not because of the smarts of the people or the lack of money, but because of the risk-taking and the adventuresome people got up and left those other places and came here. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. And now many people are kind of questioning what's the path forward for the Valley. There's been this techlash, and have we lost our soul, and what about overinvestment, and
yes to all. The good news that happened to the Valley was the internet bubble, but the better news was the internet crash, because out of the rubble came like a much more rigorous and more interesting Valley until it got overinvested in and turned toxic. And we're living through that overinvested and toxic phase. Way more money than, this just feels like the internet bubble on steroids, though when it crashes, it won't have the same effect on the U.S. economy because the only people who will lose are all the growth funds, not mom and dad in the public markets. But the toxicity is Facebook and Twitter and those and that are probably as bad as Standard Oil and anything else. I think rightly so. People are pointing out that these have had not only unintended consequences, but severe social consequences for democracy itself. And eventually it's going to come to a crash. Might look like, Theranos might look like an afterthought compared to what's going to happen to Facebook and its leadership, my opinion.
If you had your crystal ball, not a crystal ball, but you're somebody who deeply understands the underlying technology change. I'd like to return to that, as well as the business and the broader socioeconomic forces that are driving change.
Well, what's happened to the Valley is actually, besides the unending pool of capital, which looks like a cornucopia to VCs and investors, is the other piece, which isn't so intuitively obvious, is the destruction of any regulatory regime in the United States, bipartisan in the by both Democrats and Republicans for the last 20 or 30 years, which is kind of a rollback of all the regulatory bodies put in place in the 1930s, or post the 1929 crash. We used to be concerned if we're a company about the SEC. The only people the SEC could seem to find is Elon Musk. But no startup is concerned about the Securities and Exchange Commission. We used to be worried about advertising and the FTC. Anybody hear their name nowadays? And the only regulatory body kind of around is the FDA. But with Scott Gottlieb gone, it's not who was actually a innovative and interesting last commissioner. Not sure what's going to happen there. So we've kind of let any shades of regulation and oversight kind of go. And the part that people don't remember is we keep pointing to the visible faces of large corporations, like we point to Zuckerberg, but no one can name his board, or we point to, Entrepreneur X, but gee, what's really being said in that board meeting? And yeah, we say it's dual class stock, but gee, VCs have managed to remove the head of Uber when things became egregious. So right now the spotlight is not on board members, but there are times coming too. I think, and I think calling Google and Facebook a startup just does injustice to the word startup. These are large corporate, mega whatever, as big as any corporation in the United States, but that are completely unregulated and out of control and are damaging our country. I think Roger McNamee in his book Zucked, which if anybody's interested, is if this doesn't get resolved before then, it's done a good job of kind of explaining a company out of control. And then people are going to regret, I think, in 5 years having that name on their resumes.
Let's talk about the startups. You're still now an advisor. You're teaching entrepreneurs, but you're also an advisor and investor. What are the areas of technologies and startups you are most excited about, looking at not only the investment side but impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I knew that, I'd be running a hedge fund. So I'm gonna punt, but I'll say, and I mean this just as an observation, not as a criticism. The museum itself, Computer History Museum, misses half of the innovation in Silicon Valley, because the other half is in life sciences, in therapeutics and devices and diagnostics and digital health and the sum of all those, and those affect our lives probably as much or more than like what's the new app or what's the new device or what's whatever. Somebody is going to do that museum, or this museum is going to wake up and say, maybe we ought to be the Technology History Museum, because there's a lot of interest. We could have a whole nother building. In fact, a whole new set of funders for the museum if we were thinking about the history of CRISPR and Cart9 and, DNA and, where's
and these
that
things
stuff?
These intersect, right? Proteus, there are all these companies.
Yeah, but the key is they used to intersect. They don't anymore. They don't intersect for journalism. They don't intersect for VCs. They don't intersect anywhere in the Valley. When I was here, this is like the old guy talking again, almost every VC did hardware, software, and life sciences. It became so specialized that those groups saw no interest in continuing on together, and now it's hard pressed. Maybe you could count on your couple fingers the number of serious VCs who have both. But not only did that bifurcate, so did the journalism. So when you read about the tech press, everybody thinks you're reading about, again, Facebook and whatever. No one's reading about, Proteus or whoever's what. I think that's a mistake, because I think, as I said, I think the things that will make our lives better are probably the things being done in the part that the public is not as familiar with as the ones that they are. Does that make sense?
It does.
And to be honest, I wished for the museum itself to maybe think a little broader about what its charter might be, because you might be missing about 50% of the innovation entrepreneurship going on in the Valley.
Well, we'll follow up, and as I know,
No.
Daniel's going to be talking with you.
But
on that.
As to new tech, the thing that's really interesting is that the world used to follow Silicon Valley in the United States. That's no longer true. the Great Firewall, China's kind of software wall that stops innovation from coming in and information from coming in, has forced them to kind of rip off U.S. business models, but build them and adapt them locally. And eventually they're going to, much like Japan, start being creative, and they are, starting creating things internally. But it's almost like two different universes. If you go to Northwest Beijing, it feels like Silicon Valley. It used to feel like Silicon Valley in the 70s, now like Silicon Valley in the 90s. That is still rough, tumble, but now they're second and third generation entrepreneurs, but different environment, different culture, different apps. It's just like being on another planet. They could see everything we have, but we're not really exposed to their stuff. Very interesting ecosystem. So it might not. So it's clear to me that the clusters of innovation are now Northwest Beijing, Pearl River Valley, Silicon Valley, New York. Whoever thought? I would have said London, but I think Brexit is going to really damage some of that stuff. Herzliya, just out north of Tel Aviv. Pick somewhere else in Europe, and we're kind of out of, and then we would make a different list for life sciences, right? Boston, San Diego, I don't know where else, but certainly somewhere in Switzerland. But there's not 100. There's maybe 10. And by 10, I mean innovation clusters where you could raise $100 million or north by not leaving, like not needing another tank of gas. Does that make sense?
It does. It's intensely important for us as we think about what's happening, the path forward, because the Valley already doesn't define what its work is by looking inside, but every region needs to be by how they link and leverage, because the flow of people, the flow of capital is now happening globally.
What happened in my span of not even my lifetime as an entrepreneur is it used to be that innovation entrepreneurship only occurred in clusters. Now, innovation entrepreneurship is everywhere. What's not everywhere is risk capital at scale. I mean, almost in every city you could even raise some form of angel funding, but you're still limited between the capital and the mentorship and the pattern recognition. That's the value in the cluster. In Silicon Valley, the problem is that we've kind of reached maximum housing, price where people can't afford to come here anymore. And so we're almost, it might be our own kind of forcing feedback loop that kind of stops the Valley's innovative growth. It might take another quake or another crash to kind of solve that problem, which it did in 2000 and did again in the turn down in 2008 when investment stopped. We'll see.
We'll see. The Valley was last into the recession and first out in 2008, and we'll see. I'd like to turn now to your publications and some of your words. You've talked about a few things along the way, but I would like you to summarize your publications and sort of the big ideas, because as a body,
a lot of stuff.
Well, as a body, they represent a summary of your writing. So if you don't mind just going back to and
you mean what I've written, or
what you've written, your public, and I
so
mean in your books you have extensive blogs and other things,
right.
but the things that you feel like were significant.
So I wrote 2.5 books. I wrote The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which at least I'll take the claim that it helped kick off the lean startup movement. And then I wrote with Bob Dorff, my co-author, a book called The Startup Owner's Manual, which was a practical guide of, okay, we've now talked about theory, I'm teaching this class. How would you actually start either a hardware or software company? What would that look like? And I think the book was a moment in its time for when that stuff was not intuitively obvious about what do I do, and it's more of an encyclopedia than a read. And then there was a collected series of some of the best blog posts of Steve called the Not All Those Who Wander Are Lost. And then, as you mentioned, I have a blog at steveblank.com, and it must be 900 posts. I'm probably the only person who could remember all of them. I could go, well, yes, I wrote about that in 1872. It's on page 43, and they kind of fall into different categories of both, startup culture, family, corporate entrepreneurship, government entrepreneurship. just a series of kind of secret history of Silicon Valley. Um,
Do you have a favorite among all of them?
Yeah. Actually, I have two favorites. Like every entrepreneur, whatever the answer is, I'm going to take more. The first one is, and I talked about this, I think, in the first part of our interview, and it was called The Epitaph for an Entrepreneur. This, for those listeners or readers, it's worth looking that up. And it was about, again, this guy named Michael Chris, who affected my life, certainly as a public official. So I was a public official for 7 years in the state of California, and after I retired. And I wrote that one night coming back from a hearing. And the other one, I forgot what it was called, but it was about what, it was the only blog post I wrote with my wife about how to have a family and be an entrepreneur. And I have to tell you, the proudest thing I am after not only my career as an entrepreneur, but as an educator, my whole last 30 some odd years is actually my family. If you ask me what my best product is, it's my kids. I'll tell you a funny story is my wife and I, when our youngest left home, went to college, we went, great, we could do whatever we want on Christmas, great, where are we going? And when our kids heard about that, they went ballistic. What do you mean? Holidays are with the family. Vacations are with you guys. Now they're almost 30, and that's still the case. And so you don't get your report card, I remind people with young kids, until your kids leave. And the report card is, where do they want to come back to? I'll lay a good chunk of this on my wife. But one of the reasons I retired was I wanted to see my kids grow up. And they'll tell you they saw more of their dad than they ever wanted to see. But that's you don't get that memo. When our oldest daughter was born, Gwen Bell, Gordon's wife, came over and was holding Katie in her hands and said, "You know what your job is here? Change the diaper, teach her how to leave." I went, "Teach her how to leave? I just got her. What do you mean?" No. She's just going to be passing through. And so you need to teach her the set of lessons that, she's going to need to know, but she's not yours forever. And it turns out to be that. And someone else said, when I was like just a hard-charging entrepreneur when the kids were young, he said, "Steve, what do you want on your tombstone? Is it he never missed a meeting or he was a great dad?" Man, that really hit home. No one's going to put he never missed a meeting. But you really want people to remember, and the next generations to remember about what kind of parent you are. And no boss is ever going to tell you that. And you don't get a memo on that. And you find out too late sometimes in a marriage or life that you should have invested more in your family than you did in your company. And I got lucky and was able to find that out at least, hopefully not too late. So.
That was a perfect segue. I'd actually wanted to ask how you measure your life.
Yeah. I measure my life in you can't live vicariously through your kids because it's their life, and once they're gone, the good news is they call in for advice, and I try to make sure it's my opinion, not like go do this, and they know that, and it's nice that they ask for it. Some in business, and they ask mom for. Allison is the one with the MBA from Stanford in our family. She has even more good business advice than I do. But so that's one. And then two is I'm proud that, I created 2 national programs that touched lots of people. And I was part of a revolution in innovation methodology for startups in the Valley. And I'm also proud that honestly, the other way that I got to be mentored by some people I consider just spectacular is still in hindsight, still look in awe, that they paid attention. So, yeah, I think it's been a great ride. And the other thing I'm most proud of, and I had lots of adventures, that I could look back and don't have to say coulda, shoulda, woulda, didn't miss a beat. Wish I would have maybe treated people nicer when I was running through them, but not many about my career. it was a pretty long bucket list, Jumped out of an airplane, landed and got shot off a carrier, been in a war, been in jail. I mean, you go down through the list. This is a pretty long list. It was a good life. Got to start companies, got to be on a cover of a magazine when the company was on fire. I mean, it was like, how good is that? Got to raise a great family, got real lucky on a big IPO in the right time, got to retire at the right time. And given where I started, it was, who would have thought? But you stick out your thumb, and it's been a great ride.
It's really extraordinary. What a privilege for the museum to capture your story. As you think about, you're not finished yet. The story is still.
That was a great ending.
No, I'm saying your life isn't finished yet, and I just want to ask, what are you passionate about now, and what are you focused on now that you are devoting your time and your energy to?
So Pete Newell and I, the guy who I did Hacking for Defense with, and still kind of as a intellectual sparring partner, and trying to solve some real problems in the government and by fallout in large companies, are trying to get our hands around why we could create these great innovation programs mid-tier or even with corporate blessings, and yet the organizations themselves don't respond with agility and alacrity and speed when it's pretty obvious that there are urgent things for them to deal with. And while the country could afford to have Macy's go out of business, we can't afford to have the Department of Defense go out of business. But they're both being disrupted in the same way, with unfortunately both with the same types of leadership who don't understand that the environment that they've set up their organizational structure and their people and their culture are no longer relevant. And so rather than tell them you're bad, like you don't get it, is there a methodology that we could develop to do that? And we believe so. And so we're working on a book called the Innovation Doctrine to kind of do that hopefully will do for corporate and governments what Lean did for startups. We'll see. But hopefully in 2020 we'll be back here for more.
My very last question, and thanks for your patience, because the museum is focused not only on preserving for the legacy, but influencing generations to come. As you imagine a young innovator or entrepreneur who's looking to you for advice, or maybe even your grandchildren someday looking at this, how would you sum up some words of advice?
One of the biggest mistakes and opportunities is thinking that founding a company or being part of an early stage company is a job. It's the world's worst job. It's a shitty job. You gotta clean the toilets and unpack the boxes and build the whatever and raise the money and have people quit and customers whatever. It's a terrible job. It's the world's best calling. This distinction between a job and a calling isn't clearly articulated enough, because founding a startup or being part of a startup team, it's not like being an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor, where there are bounding boxes about what school you go to, what process, what license you need to have, etc. Being a founder is a lot closer to being an artist, a painter, or you don't know what the next painting is. You don't know whether that painting is going to be good or not. It's like being a sculptor or a writer or a musician, or at least one that's writing music. Did it work? Is that the right team? Is that whatever? And you become an artist because it's passion-driven, not because it's career-driven. And if you want a career and a good job, that means you're normal. And join a large company. You could join Google and Dropbox and Facebook if you want today, and you'll be surrounded by technology. And by the way, good place to start. But if you think your head is wired in a different place, if you see things that other people don't, or hear things that other people don't, and no one else hears that music but you do, welcome to the club. Welcome to my club. You're going to have a hell of a life. So welcome to Innovation Entrepreneurship. So being at the History Museum, it's I should mention this because this is not an observation about this museum or this history, but history is written by the funders and the victors. It's not the history. It's the history that's told by the survivors. Intel did not invent the first CPU, microprocessor. Andy Grove was not a saint, though his company funds a ton of the museum. Blah, blah. I mean, history, Microsoft was a rapacious and illegal competitor, though Bill Gates is now, a philanthropist like Carnegie who used to shoot strikers in the streets. So understanding the true history sometimes is colored by who's funding the historians. And I don't mean this museum, I just mean the world in general. That's one thing I just needed to say, is that it's the unspoken and untold histories. I lived through part of that, competing with Intel, so I could speak, in this case, from some knowledge, and I lived through the Microsoft story, but there are others. Again, Facebook's effect on the U.S. and what goes on in the other one is what goes on in board meetings, which never gets discussed because we tend to focus on the face of the company, which are the CEO. The second part is, and I get this from reading oral histories here at the museum and also oral histories at IEEE and ACM, is that the effect of U.S. military funding on innovation and entrepreneurship is completely missed and misunderstood, even in the histories, unless you closely read some of the responses that some of the people I was at the Princeton Institute of X. Oh, you were working for the National Security Agency.
Yeah, who funded that?
Oh, you worked on why? Well, what agency could that have been? Not that there's, quote, secrets we want to disclose, but as historians, we actually need to understand the effect of military funding directions and the cross-fertilizations or not, and the interest levels. And I just think that when I'm interested in history, I want to know where it's really coming from. When I grew up, and I'm going to give you the civilian side of this, we learned history in the United States about the Civil War, and then somehow there was something called the Reconstruction and maybe carpetbaggers, and then we skipped to the Progressive era. Well, what happened in those 35 years? It turned out the United States was a pretty nasty place. We had ethnic cleansing, we had ethnic pogroms, we had, it's a pretty terrible place. There's a history out called the Republic for Which It Stands, which kind of goes through that era. And as Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice ultimately swings to the good side, but this was not a good place to be. Yet our histories kind of skip that stuff. And so I kind of now treat history as kind of, that's the halftime score, and I just wonder what the rest of the score is. And please don't take this as any comment here, but doing an oral history in a history museum makes me think about the histories of questions left unasked and people not yet spoken to. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So that's it. That's the sidebar. Well, I don't know if it's important, but it's just, I would never have been thinking about this until you guys asked me in, and then me thinking about all the histories I've read, knowing that guy, here, I'll give you my, who's the guy who did the biography of Steve Jobs and of...
Walter Isaacson.
Isaacson. Great, did the History of the Valley, right? A History of Technology, one of his last books.
The Innovators.
The Innovators. And one of the great things about, he manages as a journalist to put a lot of pieces together, but it was an example of a journalist writing history. He talks about a guy named Davies who did some early packet switching work. Did I tell you this story?
No.
All right. And of course, describing Davies' history. Well, obviously he saw the phrase, but he had no idea what it meant. So he said, Davies in World War II worked on tubes used in, nuclear something production. What he didn't understand is what he obviously read is Davies was actually part of the British nuclear weapons program called tube alloys. And unless you actually understood the history, then you rewrote the history into something meaningless when someone else reading it went, wait a minute, he was part of tube alloys? Holy cow. There was a much deeper place to go where he didn't go at all. Does that make sense? And as I said, those histories, which was the intent of the Secret History of Silicon Valley, is to explain that yes, they're thought of as separate, but there's a world where they actually did overlap, and we don't do a good job of explaining it because most people don't know where to go.